All right, so back to our conversation about UDL. Last time we used some examples to understand multiple means of representation that we can use again as we think about multiple means of engagement. So we think about my son Henry, doesn't read for pleasure, but will read for information. And so that's a way to engage Henry. So if I'm going to assign Henry a 5-paragraph theme, and he needs to read some things to write that 5-paragraph theme, I may not assign some essays written by Thoreau to explore transcendentalism. I would probably present him with some essays that were factual based or process based to have him write that essay, right? So multiple means of engagement based on the student's interests. My second teaching job was in a school. I always taught in psychiatric hospitals, which is a little bit different than most special ed teachers' background. But in my second job, I was working in a program. They were students from the community that I was working in who received half of the day educational services and half of the day in psychotherapy, group therapy, and individual therapy. And one of the young men that I taught, he had some particular challenges at home, and the first year that I taught him, he really wasn't engaged in the education process at all. But in his second year, his home situation had changed, and he had kind of woken up to the reality that he needed to graduate from high school and that he needed to get high school credit. And so he became a much more motivated learner. And he needed 2 sections of math, and he'd done sort of the consumer math, but he needed one other math class. And as a teacher, in talking to him and helping him make the decision, he was not a math person. And so he decided that geometry would be the way that he would get that second credit. And he had a really hard time getting his head around not the concepts of geometry. There was something about his personal life that I'll share in a second that made him particularly good at the concepts of geometry. The trick was the geometry words, the words associated with math that he didn't have the background for. And so the thing that I knew about this young man is that he had moved to live with his grandparents, and his grandfather was kind of a regionally well-known builder of race car engines. And so this is something that this young man and his grandpa did together. They worked in a mechanic shop together building these engines. And if you're someone that has worked on cars or built an engine, you know that geometry is a skill that you have to build an engine. And at that time of my life, my personal hobby was I was restoring old cars, old Volkswagen vans. And so I knew a little something about building engines, but I could not crack this young man's really just mindset about not being able to do geometry. And so I got this idea that it was probably one of those beg forgiveness, not ask permission ideas. And so I lived just a few blocks from the school where I taught. And so one Sunday afternoon, I loaded this engine block and all these engine parts and my engine stand and my tools into my truck, and I drove up to school and I kind of cleaned out this back storage room, and I laid down a tarp and laid out all the tools and all the parts. And the next day when it was time for math, I told my paraprofessionals that I was going to take Philip into the back room, and they looked at me a little weird. I knew I should have said that in a different way. But for 3 days, Philip and I worked together putting this engine together. And we had a great time doing it. We saw each other not as a teacher and a student relationship, but 2 people working on a project and a problem together. And so that took us about 3 days. And then on the 4th day, we went back to the classroom, and I tossed his geometry book on his desk, and he got the defeated look on his face because he'd done something fun. And so we started working through just kind of random pages in the geometry book, and he put up his, this is something all teachers are aware of, this just mental block that students can put up when something's too challenging or too far outside their reach. And instead of using the examples or the story problems from the book, I created some story problems and examples that related to what we'd done building the engine. And I'd like to say that that was just like a magic bullet that popped the bubble and Philip immediately got geometry. He didn't. We still had a lot of work to do, but it was an action that allowed him to open his mind a bit, to come to understand that, okay, this isn't some foreign language that I'm never going to understand. This is something where I can find practical application. And these ideas aren't new to the idea of universal design. For years we've been talking that as we teach new skills, we attach new information to old information. We talk about schema or scaffolding, that we have to add new ideas to old ideas. And so a lot of multiple means of engagement is just knowing where that scaffolding needs to take place. If you're a fan of Vygotsky's work, Vygotsky talks about zones of proximal development. Vygotsky is one of my favorites just because I like saying his name. It's kind of like the onomatopoeia of the psychology education world. And so with zones of proximal development, I always think about this as stepping stones across a creek or a stream. And so I'm pretty tall, I have pretty long legs. And so I'm also very clumsy, so in reality, if I needed stepping stones, they would need to be very close together, just like someone with shorter legs. But someone who is tall and has long legs and is also coordinated, they need bigger distances in their stepping stones, or can utilize bigger distances in their stepping stones to move forward. And that's sort of like what it is with learning, right? Some students are able to take leaps and bounds in their learning, and other students need smaller steps. And so it's knowing that difference, how to engage students based on what they need to move from point A to point B. And maybe there's an A.1 and an A.2 and an A.3. And so it's just finding out students. It's all boils down to relationships, having relationships with our students, knowing where they are, and knowing what's most effective to teach them new skills.